modern battle. Tanks, assault guns, artillery, bombers, pursuit ships. The deadliest machines ever known to warfare flung upon the enemy so that the infantryman, the foot soldier, can cover the 500 yards of earth before him with his rifle and advance and occupy and hold enemy territory. That is how wars are won. That is how this war will be won. Wars are not won by machines. Wars are won by courage, daring, skill, and imagination. Wars are won by determined and violent men who are willing to die. But in Poland, the Nazis found courageous men who were willing to die. In Norway, there were skilled and determined soldiers. In Greece, the sons of Athens made a new Thermopylae. In Belgium, in Yugoslavia, there were bitter and heroic men. In Bataan, there were tremendous soldiers. But Poland was lost, and Norway was lost, and Greece, and Belgium, and Yugoslavia, and Malaya, and Singapore, and Shanghai, and Mandalay. And the good soldiers and the brave civilians were lost with them. All their daring and all their skill and determination counted as nothing. Wars are not won by machines, but they are lost without them. Long before we began to prepare, the Nazis were trading butter for guns, marching into the Rhineland, rolling into Austria, murdering Czechoslovakia. Long before Detroit and Pittsburgh dreamed of war, the Chinese were dying in Manchuria and Shanghai. Long before we broke ground for powder plants and tank arsenals, the Japanese were rehearsing diplomacy and murder. Then we began to erase too little and too late from the vocabulary of the United Nations. The country that had built more convertible coupes and more radio phonographs than the world had ever seen rolled up its sleeves and started the mighty job of beating the plow and the gadget and the family sedan into the sword. The sword today is the truck, the field gun, the pursuit ship, the tank. And when these tanks and guns and trucks are built, the oil and ammunition to feed them and the men to use and service them must cross all the oceans of the world, where the submarine and the surface raider lie in wait. And the torpedo planes and the dive bombers roam the skies. But the goods are made and the goods are delivered. In a short time, we've come a long way. Undersecretary of War Robert P. Patterson reports on our progress.
In this war, strategy and production are inseparable. Remember this: the enemy will be beaten by the full weight of American arms and American industry, together with the force of our allies. The War Department is proud of its production record for 1942, both because of the improvement in quantity and the improvement in quality. The output of industry for the War Department was less than $1 billion in 1940. It reached some $3 billion in 1941. For 1942, this production, including construction, was $25 billion. Moreover, the output of war materiel has gone swiftly to the troops. Of course, we are not satisfied. The demands of war are insatiable. We will never be satisfied as long as the war lasts.
Logistics is the name for the business of making and delivering the goods, the science of transportation and supply in war. Modern war is a war of logistics. Today, supplies determine strategy, even more than strategy determines supply. If you can produce the food, the steel, the machines, and keep them moving along the highways and over the sea lanes, then you can attack. Then you can invade. Not before. Supply today is a total idea. Supply today is a whole nation at work, making and moving the fighting implements for victory. The problem of logistics has increased with each of our wars in fantastic geometric ratio. In the Revolutionary War, every soldier was almost his own quartermaster. When necessary, he foraged for his food. And if he did not sleep in the field, he was quartered upon the citizens of the nearest town. If wounded, he had to rely on his fellow soldiers for help. We have an army of 8 million men. 8 million men cannot be quartered upon the citizens of the town, nor can they forage for their food. And not only must these millions of men be fed and quartered, but dressed and equipped and transported and supplied, paid, healed, and amused by the Army. This gigantic task is handled by the Army Service Forces, formerly known as the Services of Supply, under the command of Lieutenant General Breon Somerville.
Liberty is an expensive luxury. It must be paid for endlessly in blood and toil and devotion.
The Army in the United States is divided into 3 major parts: ground, air, and service forces. Ground under General McNair, air under General Arnold, service forces under General Somerville, all combined under General Marshall to make our Army more deadly at its job, killing more Nazis, more Japanese. Here are our enemies in their most acceptable position. The Army Service Forces was born into a new kind of world for Americans, a world of shortages. Until now, America had been the profligate of the world. But the Japs came down the rice fields of Malaya to Singapore, burning and looting. We found ourselves without rubber. Tankers flamed along our coasts, and we discovered that we could not get all the gasoline we needed. Our allies who were fighting in our front lines in Libya, in Russia, in China, over the British Isles, our allies who were killing our enemies needed our supplies. But to earn it, what labors are demanded? Here is where we must be lavish and miserly, robber and watchman. Lavish with guns and materials where they will hurt the enemy most. Miserly at every single non-essential point. Liberty is an expensive luxury, but one which Americans refuse to go without. The Army Service Forces has armed and fed American soldiers all over the map of the world. New Guinea, Morocco, China, Egypt, India, Dakar, Iceland, the Aleutians. The first job of the Army Service Forces is the procurement and distribution of supplies and the construction of necessary facilities. It has given out contracts, built factories and camps, designed and standardized tools of war so that no slow-up of production lines will lose a battle, so that no American soldier faces an enemy equipped with superior weapons. It has bought everything from baseballs to field kitchens, from Bibles to bayonets, from rubber bands to locomotives. All these things must be bought. They must be stored. They must be issued. The Army Service Forces has helped the great electric refrigerator manufacturer make machine guns. Has helped turn a company that made burial vaults into a manufacturer of 100-pound bombs. This work is performed by the 7 supply services of the Army Service Forces: Ordnance, Quartermaster, Engineers, Signal, Medical, Chemical Warfare, and Transportation. A second big job is personnel, the induction of men for the entire Army and the maintenance of their health and welfare. The Army Service Forces operates and supplies all Army camps, posts, and stations throughout its service commands. Another great job. It also operates the Army communications system and transports supplies all over the world. This global enterprise demands an immense organization. 20% of the enlisted personnel of the Army of the United States, and 1 million civilian workers in posts, depots, ports, and arsenals. Here is the raw material of our Army, sweeping in day after day. From these men, from these clerks and farmers and students and salesmen and mechanics, the Army must shape in a short time the tough soldiers who will fight on desert, in jungle, in snow, on top of the world, on 4 continents, who will fight against soldiers of nations whose one profession is war, whose one education is war. Nations whose children goose-step and practice hatred from infancy and play grotesque and barbarous games at recess in kindergarten. Never has there been a war in which civilian skills of the soldiers have been so valuable to the armed forces. X-ray technicians, cooks and motion picture cameramen, clerks, welders, radio operators, surveyors, telephone linesmen. The Army needs them all and has a job for them all to do. And it is in the great initial sifting process at the reception centers that the Adjutant General's Department has to place the square peg in the square hole and the round peg in the round hole. But long before the men arrive at the reception center, the Army Service Forces has been working night and day to prepare a place for them to sleep, food for them to eat, clothes for them to wear, tools for them to use. It has been said that the Army Service Forces does the Army's housekeeping, but what a housekeeping it is. It's a housekeeping for a race of giants done by a race of giants. So many barracks have been built by the engineers that their floors would make a lumber road almost as long as the Alcan Highway. Included in the Army's housekeeping is the repair and maintenance of enough railway trackage to stretch from New York to St. Louis. Food is the quartermaster's business, one of his many businesses. He must feed the soldier from induction to 6 months after the duration. And what an appetite to feed. The clothing of the soldier is also the job of the Quartermaster Corps. At the reception center, the new recruit is given over 40 separate items of clothing. Here he gets shoes that must survive hundreds of miles of grueling marches, fatigue suits that must last through kitchen police, rifle drill, and campaigns. Here is tailoring to make a veteran of the last war green with envy. The Quartermaster Corps of the Army Service Forces sees that our soldiers are warmly dressed in Alaska and Iceland and coolly dressed in Africa and New Guinea. That when the order comes to march, each man's shoes fit him and are in marching condition. When a man is classified, he's assigned to a particular branch of the ground forces, air forces, or service forces itself. In a few short months, the Army must take these shirt-sleeved, unmilitary civilians and turn them into first-class fighting men. The soldier's record, which includes all his transfers, promotions, derelictions, commendations, is kept with almost fanatical attention to accuracy by men trained by the Adjutant General of the Army Service Forces. The Adjutant General's office also developed the intelligence test and the mechanical aptitude tests, which determine the fields of a man's usefulness to the Army. The soldier's rifle is supplied by the Ordnance Department. All his weapons, the machine guns, the mortars, the field artillery, the assault guns, the anti-aircraft guns, all the man-killing and armor-piercing machinery with which later he will fight for his life are given him by ordnance. While While some officers of the Army Service Forces buy and issue equipment, others direct and train service troops. Along with the rest of the recruits, the men of the service forces spend their first weeks of enlistment going through regular basic training. Kitchen police, calisthenics, lectures on military courtesy and tactics, realistic defense against chemical attack, obstacle courses to develop speed, agility, aggressiveness, stamina, hard work to build a tough, rugged army. In every combat outfit, whether in the Aleutians, Panama, or the Mediterranean, there are men trained by the Army Service Forces in the foxholes under the punishment of bombers, fighting beside the infantry, the armored force, the air force. In the ordnance schools, men are trained to repair motorized equipment and to supply the ammunition of war for the fighting forces. New vehicles, new artillery, new bombs, so important in this war of techniques, are all tested at ordnance proving grounds. In the Quartermaster Corps, men do all the 1,001 jobs that must be done in order to provision and clothe the Army. Cobbling and laundering in all conditions in the field are just two ways of maintaining and salvaging clothing and equipment. Communications are now more than ever the lifeblood of a fighting army. Without them, an army is a blind monster blundering into destruction. All the different means of communications and the maintenance and repair of the complex machinery necessary to keep communications open must be done by the Signal Corps of the Army Service Forces. Radio operation and wireless code, telephone line construction, telephone switchboard installations and operation, running that nerve plexus of the Army, the message center. The Army Service Forces engineers must do all construction jobs, build bridges, maintain roads, demolish installations, assault enemy fortified positions. The Chemical Warfare Service, which issues each soldier his gas mask, lies in wait for the first attack of deadly gas by the enemy and is ready to meet fire with fire. Medical Corps troops keep 8 million men healthy. This means work like giving typhoid, tetanus, and smallpox shots. Work like giving blood plasma to casualties on the battlefield. Work that in so many cases means the difference between a gravestone and a living soldier. Doctors of the Army Service Forces operate the great base hospitals at home, where the wounded are cared for and the sick brought back to health. The WACs, too, come under the Army Service Forces. They are being trained to replace men and free them for frontline duty. The WACs are led by Colonel Ovita Kalpabi, the best-looking colonel in the United States Army. For officer candidates, there are the schools of each branch of the service forces, where in 3 grueling months, officers who are not only leaders of men, but technical experts are produced. These men have shown their value at posts of danger and responsibility throughout the Army. They've made certain that regardless of conditions, the ammunition was supplied, the message delivered, the roadway completed. The Alcan Highway to Alaska, lifeline over 1,500 miles of Arctic wilderness, was laid by the Corps of Engineers. In New Guinea and Australia, in Africa and Iceland, men trained by the Army Service Forces hurry to completion in a few hours the new mesh airfields, from which in a wide circle our land-based planes patrol the seas, making it safe for American shipping. And the aircraft locators, including the new tremendously sensitive radar equipment which guard our homes and outposts, are handled by men of the Signal Corps. The last message from Corregidor was sent by a Signal Corps man. It looks like firing has ceased on both sides. Corregidor used to be a nice place, but it's haunted now. The Army Service Forces acts not only as restaurant and doctor, bridge builder and courier, but also as lawyer. Court-martials are advised by officers of the Judge Advocate General's Department. The 8 Nazi saboteurs who landed on the coast of America from submarines were prosecuted by the Office of the Judge Advocate General. Their execution was arranged by the Provost Marshal General. This military policeman on the beach at Oran was trained by the Provost Marshal. They are traffic directors, policemen, security guard for camps and installations. They're in charge of all prisoners of war. There are 110,000 MPs in this country and abroad, the largest police force in the world. Under the Army Service Forces, too, comes that organization dear to the heart of every soldier, finance. Finance officers in more than 1,000 pay stations pay the American soldier the highest wage that has ever been paid fighting men. The Post Exchange Service trains officers for the administration of the $500 million-a-year business of the general store of the Army camp, the Post Exchange, which sells to the soldier everything from ice cream and donuts to pine cushions with camp cloth embroidered with beads on the covers. The Army Service Forces runs over 700 War Department theaters where the latest movies are shown. This is under the Special Service Division, which ships the pictures throughout the world and collects 12 million paid admissions every month. The Army also provides live entertainment. It sends out movie stars, singers, dancers, jugglers, jazz bands, and symphony orchestras to entertain the men and make them forget for a moment the long, weary miles of marches, the aching muscles of the obstacle course, the boredom of kitchen police. Finally, when they face the enemy, these moments of pleasure pay off in hidden reservoirs of resolution, goodwill, and morale. At a time like this, in the middle of the adventure of war, young men who might otherwise not think about such matters will soberly reflect upon religion. The Corps of Chaplains of 3,000 ordained priests, ministers, and rabbis is recruited and trained by the Army Service Forces. It is to the chaplains that the enlisted man goes not only for spiritual advice, but with personal problems. 53,000 church services were held in a single month last year by Army chaplains all over the world. Now the men have been received into the Army, classified, clothed, immunized against contagious diseases, trained by the ground, air, and service forces, fed, toughened, and sent through maneuvers, have become expert in handling their weapons. Now comes the supreme test of the Army Service Forces, invasion. It started on a clear, sunny morning in Washington. The grave words, "We will attack in Africa," were spoken and approved. A few days later, into the old munitions building went 12 generals and colonels from the Army Service Forces, part of the everyday throng of officers passing through the old halls. Two hours later, they left, carrying with them the greatest American military secret up to that time, the decision to send an American expeditionary force to North Africa. The sailing date for the great task force had been fixed. Their job was to gather the might and armor of the nation into the one fist that a quarter of a year later was to crash on the German along the Mediterranean. The German was at the gate of Egypt when the Army Service Forces began to plan the movement of men and supplies. The German was at the gate of Egypt, but these late-burning lights in Washington were guns pointing straight at Tunis. To prepare and equip such an expedition requires immense labor and planning. It is like building 10 boulder dams, 10 million fine watches, all in 3 months. Simultaneously, things began happening all over the country. 2 million maps of the North African terrain, detailed down to the last church and schoolhouse, were drawn and printed by the engineers. The camps were selected where the troops would gather before entraining for the seacoast. The shipment of troops and supplies from the United States and from the United Kingdom was arranged. A rendezvous off Gibraltar agreed upon. And the materials to go to the Mediterranean and to Casablanca decided upon. At the same time, the Army Service Forces received and transmitted instructions on equipping troops. The 700,000 separate items that the task forces received in gift from the Army Service Forces had to be routed and distributed from depots. Supplies had to be procured. Some goods moved straight from production lines to ports of embarkation. Then the troops began to move up from the desert camps of California, from the prairie camps of Missouri, from the camps along the tidal rivers of the South. The infantrymen, the armored divisions, the tank destroyer battalions, the Air Force ground crews, the signalmen and engineers, the medics and ordnance men tramped the country's roads on their way to their appointment with the enemy. Equipment was checked and tested. Obsolete and damaged material was replaced. Only the best American machines and men for the Nazis. Onto the thousands of trains assembled secretly by the Transportation Corps rumbled the machines of war. The men lined up along the tracks and climbed aboard the waiting trains. The train started. They were on their way to the points of embarkation near the ports of the East. Train pulled on toward the seacoast. The staggered migration of armed men toward the waiting ships clicked smoothly and secretly on the split-second schedules of the Transportation Corps of the Army Service Forces. cars and locomotives and trackage from all the great railroads of the country. For each armored division, 23 Pullmans, 383 tourist sleepers, 1,748 flat cars, 68 baggage cars, the trains of Santa Fe and Union Pacific, of Pennsylvania and New York Central, of Southern Pacific and Erie, of Seaboard and Baltimore and Ohio, all rolling toward Africa. Men and guns, guns and men. At the same time, ships were assembled from the 7 oceans at the docks and moorings of the great eastern ports. The harbors filled with the transports and freighters that keep our lifelines open across the seas. The goods of war poured into the riverside warehouses and onto the docks. The tons of steel, the clever, fatal machines, the acres of food, the ocean of oil, the new wine of battle, were all made ready. The new exports of America, death and destruction, stood waiting on the quays. Stevedores of the Army Service Forces swung the bombers, the huge half-tracks, the great trucks, and all the heavy materiel of war into the holds. Ships were combat loaded. Men had to come off ready to fight. That meant that weeks before, men of the Transportation Corps had to chart the disposition of every single last buck private, every last can of oil. Now the men marched into the ships that were to carry them to the enemy. Smoothly, in a never-ending flow, 12 a minute, they went to their appointed bunks. Sailing day, planned so long before, has arrived. What was just a word spoken, a notation on a piece of paper, has become an army in ships. The loving labor of hundreds of thousands of men has been lavished upon these Americans bound overseas. The day has arrived. Sailing day. Sailing day for the Garand rifles. Sailing day for the 105-millimeter howitzers, for the 50-caliber machine guns. Sailing day for the prime Chicago beef, for the well-cut uniforms, for the smoke shells of the Edgewood Arsenal. Sailing day for the trained, determined men from Iowa, and the men from California, and the men from Kentucky. Sailing day for the boys from your hometown, for the boy down the street. Sailing day for the hopes of the world. This is the African Armada. This is the great parade of 850 transports and naval escort from America and Britain, from whose decks dropped the men who swept the long coast of Africa clear up to the port of Bizerte in 3 days. This is our first huge investment in the offense. This is America's initial great gamble in the European war. Protected by the ships and guns of our Navy, life on board goes on as usual. The morale officer arranges amusements. The men pray and defend themselves. They keep fit for the job ahead. They stand battle inspection, eat and sleep, and collect their wages. Over the horizon lie Algiers and Tunis and Bizerte, the rich cities of the African plain, the great prize for which all is risked. Now the Armada approaches the coast of Africa. The guns of the Navy open the attack to drive away hostile fire. Operations are now under the control of the theater command. With the first of the troops, men trained by the Army Service Forces swing over the sides into the landing barges and set out for the disputed shore. Once the beachhead has been established, debarkation is turned over to supply officers. The ships swiftly disgorge their valuable cargo. Even while the fighting is going on, the Army Service Forces must make sure that the pipeline of supplies feeding the Army overseas is kept full. Now comes the painstaking preparation for advance. Ordnance's bombs for Rummel supply depots. Quartermaster's gas for the motors that must roar along the coastal road toward Tunis. Machine gun bullets that will punish the infantry of the Africa Corps. Mortar shells for the grim business of lobbing death at strong points. The lines of communication are opened. Equipment is stowed in trucks. Men clamber in and head eastward. Americans roll toward battle. Wheels and shoe leather relentlessly on the trail of the Nazis. Wheels, shoe leather, steel, and wings springing the African trap. Now the last deadly lull, the final tense listening and waiting. And now, battle. This is the moment for which all the planning and worrying and overwork and arguing and building and carrying was but a preparation. This is the moment for which the iron came out of the ground of Michigan, was beaten in the forges of Pittsburgh. For this moment, the men left the farms of Iowa and the pavements of Seattle. For this moment, American ingenuity made guns in boiler factories, helmets in toy shops. These infantrymen, at this lonely and desperate moment, workers kept the factories going 24 hours a day. For this moment, the steel wheels clicked ceaselessly along all the railroads, great and small, of America. Gunpowder and muscle, lead and sweat, steel and resolution, battle lines and factories, all welded, nourished by the same will for victory. This is the moment for which the Army Service Forces has planned and built, hauled and carried, trained and traveled. This is the moment when men from the Army Service Forces stand in the front line with their brothers in arms and fight and die. This is the moment that must come before the day when the last enemy stronghold is reduced, and the Army Service Forces can start working on its last great problem, bringing the Army home.